Hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about what are the top 10 mistakes students do in their PhD thesis. Yeah, and that could result in getting a fail. So, what I want you to learn from this session today is what are the common things that we as examiners look for when we are evaluating your PhD thesis. And these common mistakes, if you know earlier on, you would be in a better position to avoid them. And maybe if you're watching this video, if you're in the first year, second year, or third year of your PhD, doesn't matter as long as you remember these 10 points. Okay, so let's get started with this. So the top 10 mistakes are first is lack of originality, right? What happens is when you're doing your PhD research, there has to be sufficient originality to the contribution that you're making in your thesis, right? So if you're not making significant contribution, then it is one of the first things that people or examiners would pick up in your thesis, right? So one of the primary expectations is that it should contribute new knowledge or insights to its field. A common mistake is when the work fails to offer a clear and significant advancement or original insight. Yeah. So, what is it that you can do to address this challenge? Yeah. One thing is you need to know what is considered as sufficient knowledge or new knowledge that is worthy of a PhD, because this is your first PhD. On most occasions, you will not know what is considered to be substantial contribution to the field of knowledge and whether that is equivalent to a PhD or not. So, this is where your PhD supervisor, your guide, your mentor would be very helpful in assessing whether what you are doing as part of your PhD is sufficient or not. So take their inputs. Sometimes when you present your research proposal for your PhD to a panel at a university, they will also provide you with that guidance, that whether the contribution that you are planning to make during your PhD, whether it is sufficient for a PhD or not. So take their inputs constructively. Yeah, don't consider it as a negative feedback when they say that either your work is too shallow or is it too much and it is beyond the scope, yeah, that you could not finish. So take their inputs in a positive way so that you are able to make sure that your PhD research is of a acceptable quality or a high quality, and later towards the end you do not get into a situation where you realize that, oh, my research is not significant or sufficient. So that initial input that you receive from these experts is very valuable and very important. The next point is poor methodology. Okay, so inadequate research design or lack of methodological rigor is another reason why your research will be weak or your thesis will be weak. Yeah. So as an examiner, we look for flaws in research design, yeah, such as improper control variables, sample size issues. Maybe the research needs a minimum 100, 200, 400 responses, and you only have 50. See, these are some standard things that we look for when we are assessing the thesis, right? Unsuitable analytical methods. All these things, research design is a very important stage in your research, and the design of your research or the experiments that you plan, they all have to prove that the work that you are doing is significant, and that is the best way to undertake that work. Okay, so do put sufficient thought into research design. Why this research design, or why this methodology, why not something else? If you are in the business school, you may do a quantitative research or a qualitative research or mixed methods based research. You have to have a reason why this method or methodology is suitable for the research that you are trying to answer, the research question that you are trying to answer. So it has to be very clear in that context. The next thing is Lack of methodological rigor. So this includes failing to justify chosen methods or not aligning them with your research questions. So not only do justification is important, but how you apply that method, that also plays a very important role to ensure that your research is your methodology is strong. Because see, what is methodology, right? If you just think about it, methodology is a way of doing thing, yeah, a way of doing research. So if you compare it with some other method of doing something else, right, maybe cooking for example, if you have to cook a dish, you have to follow a recipe, right? And that recipe gives the end flavor to the food. So if you use the proper ingredients in the proper way and you follow the right process of putting this ingredient first and then this and then this and then this and heat it for 5 minutes and then simmer it for 10 minutes or whatever the recipe may be, you are following that because in the end the dish that you're making is going to be delicious and tasty, right? So same thing, same analogy you have to apply when you're considering your research methodology. Yeah, why should you why should you consider the research design phase very strongly? Because if you do not consider that, then the end dish will not be tasty or not delicious, right? It has to be, your research has to be equally good and engaging and very tasty. People should enjoy your research. So to get to that stage, you need to know what are the right ingredients and in which order these ingredients have to be put together to make a very strong research output. So this is what is a way to explain research design. So your research design, basically you can consider that as a recipe for making a dish or recipe for making your research. So the third mistake that happens is a weak structure and organization, which means there is a disorganized content. So you have a lack of structure, which makes it difficult, which makes a thesis difficult to follow. So as an examiner and later as a reader of your thesis, they should get a clear idea of how you have structured the thesis and why is it structured that way. So that explanation or that clarity, it has to be there in yourself first. You have to understand like what is how do you think you want to structure your thesis. Yeah, so that visibility, that knowledge, that thinking of the structure is very important, because that is how you decide how you will write up your thesis, right? So given that fact, what I often see, there is like jumping of ideas and there is no logical progression of chapters and sections seems to be disconnected, disorganized, and it is just not easy to read. So sometimes when you read a very nice research paper, why it is feels very nice to read? Because a lot of effort has gone into structuring the paper or the thoughts very logically, very clearly. So what you should do, and I think I have covered some of this in one of my earlier videos, where you decide the structure of your thesis, yeah, or the structure of your chapter, and you can get advice from chat gpt or many other ai tools that are available. So with that structure, you at least have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and so on. The minimum chapters that you need will be introduction, literature review, methodology, findings, discussion, and conclusion. At least 5 chapters, right? So in these 5 chapters, what are the standard headings or subheadings that should be there? Yeah, so you can derive those headings based upon your research topic, yeah, or research question. Once you have that from a section, yeah, from like a chapter 1, section 1, so 1.1, let's say. So at 1.1 you have to now decide what are the 1.1, 1.2, and all the other subsections within that chapter. And there are again some standard sections that you would see are typically followed in your research area or in your research field. So look at that. If you don't have, go to ChatGPT, ask, give me some suggested table of content for my thesis. So that is the second level done. The third level of organization is what are you going to write under each section of the of each subsection of your chapter. Again, you can get ideas. What should be the theme of this paragraph? Maybe let's imagine there are three paragraphs in one subsection. Each paragraph has to have a specific purpose why it is there. It is not randomly you think of a sentence and then you write and then you write something else, then you write something else. No, that's not the way to do it, right? Imagine another analogy here, right? When you're going to build a house, what do you do first? You go to an architect and ask the architect to draw a plan. Yeah, so you will say that I want 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 2 living rooms, a space for my car, and so on. So that is the requirement. So based upon that requirement, the architect designs you a plan. This is the room 1, room 2, room 3, room 4. This is outdoor area, and so on and so forth. Now, when you go to the builder can build it as per that plan. So you have to follow the same analogy. Don't start building before planning. Yeah. So you have to go to an architect. In this case, could be ChatGPT. Yeah. That can give you a very good layout for the structure of your thesis. Yeah. Do that first and break it down. Every section by section, what each section should be, what are you going to write in that. And if you've seen my earlier videos, I have suggested a strategy which I call as the questioning strategy with ChatGPT, which is where you ask ChatGPT, give me some suggested questions that I can answer so I can write something useful in this part of my thesis or this part of my chapter or my paper. Yeah. So follow that. That way, your entire thesis from start to finish will be very structured properly and organized correctly, so that when someone is reading, they can see that, okay, this paragraph talks about something which is then connected to this one and then connected to this one. And the reason why they can make sure that that connection happens or is there is because you have thought about that before. So it is not like a writing without thinking. So you have thought about it and then you have come up with that idea, right? So keep that in mind. That is very essential. A poor integration of literature. This is another thing. Failing to adequately review relevant literature or integrate it properly into the discussion to frame the research context and justify the research. So research justification is very crucial, very important. And if you do not justify why you are doing this research, I think you are failing then and there itself, because you need to have a very clear idea and clear thought of why you are doing this research. And if you cannot justify it yourself, you can't justify it to the examiner or the reader. So give it a very deep thought on how you are going to justify your research, why you are doing your research. So there is a nice video by Simon Sinek which talks about why, finding out the why. So watch that video. It is a very famous lecture by him, and that video will give you the strategy to define your why you are doing your research. Okay, let's move on to the fourth one, inadequate engagement with literature. So over reliance on certain text, using a limited range of sources to heavily depending on one or two key texts can suggest a lack of breadth, in understanding the field. Utilizing old references, that is another issue when newer research is available and can indicate that research context is not fully developed. So see, this is a challenge. This is a challenge which I see, and a reason why that happens is students, when they start their PhD, they are doing their literature review, right? So when they begin the literature review, that is probably the first year of your PhD. And when they're writing their thesis, that is maybe the third or fourth year of their PhD. So in that 3 years or 2 years, a lot of research has progressed. And you need to understand that when somebody is reading your thesis, they don't realize that you started 3 years or 4 years ago. They are reading the thesis now. Even the examiner is reading the thesis now. What is the first thing that they're going to do? They're going to add or type your research topic or research question into Google Scholar and see what recent research they get. And if those papers are not included in your literature review, it shows lack of literature in your lack of understanding of the field, because you have not covered sufficient literature. So that is a very common problem, but the answer is also very easy. The other thing is the older references. So some old academic articles are okay if they are seminal papers in your field, but if majority of your research is like anything more than 4 or 5 years old, it is a problem. You know why? Because it is simple mathematics or logic. You are starting your PhD, say today, and you're finishing and you're writing your thesis in 3 years' time. Yeah. So if you are choosing something that is 3 years behind your PhD time, somebody may have completed their PhD and would have had their results or just about to publish their results when you're starting your research. Yeah. So if you're picking up a problem from the past, it is very likely that it may have been solved already. And if you do not do a very thorough literature review, you will be you will have that problem where you may be working on something that has already been solved. So don't rely too much on older references. Refer to recent literature, because that will give you the most up to date information in your field. Next is poor writing style, writing quality, or formatting issues. And this is, I cannot believe that I see it so many times. I have reviewed, I guess, over 50 PhD thesis. I have don't even have a count of that now, but definitely more than that. And I have seen this issue coming up again and again. And you know what that shows? It shows that you're not very careful. If your quality of writing is poor, if you're not formatting your thesis correctly, it shows an inherent problem in your approach, yeah, towards work. And what we would try to infer from that is, it may be the same thing that you have done with your research. You may not be very careful in your research, so we will doubt your research findings, and we will more investigate thoroughly. We will try to find out, whether something is wrong here, whether something is wrong there, because the impression that you give by such mistakes is, it just paves a way to in a wrong direction for us to look. Okay, so be very careful on this poor writing quality and formatting issues. Like, sometimes there are mistakes in the table of contents. Come on, I mean, this is your thesis. How can you have a mistake in the table of content? That is probably the first thing that people or reviewers will see, or examiners or the readers will read. How can you have a mistake there? Another thing is mistakes in abstract. That is the one thing that a lot of examiners read. The very first introduction, abstract, introduction, and conclusion. These three things we read, and then we get a gist of what you have done in your research. We typically make up our mind at that stage on what should be the assessment given for this thesis. So you have to be very mindful that, and the reason why these mistakes happen here, there is also a reason, is on most of the time you are, as a student, focused more on finishing your thesis, and that means finishing your literature review, your methodology, your findings and discussion section. And these the abstract, introduction, and the conclusion are like the end bits that we will just do it. Let us finish the main part first. But while finishing the main part, you ignore the relevant parts which are relevant from the examiner's point of view. So that's why these mistakes happen. So you should be very careful that abstract, introduction, and conclusion, 3 sections should be perfect. In the middle part of the thesis, if there are some mistakes, that's acceptable. But table of contents, abstract, introduction, conclusion, title page, there should be no mistake, nothing, no mistake acceptable in those sections of your paper, of your thesis. Okay, let's move on to the next one, and that is inadequate critical analysis. So descriptive rather than analytical. And this is what I have said earlier as well, that a lot of time the literature review chapter is not a literature review, but it sounds or reads more like a literature summary, which is author, whoever, did this, somebody else did this, somebody else did this. I'm not there to know what others have done. I can read that from their abstract, right? What I'm here to read is, what do you think about their work? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it poor? Could it be better? I want those insights when I'm reading your literature review chapter. I don't want to know what they have done, because what they have done, they have written it in their research paper or their thesis already. You don't need to tell me that, right? What you have to tell me is your opinion about their work. Yeah, so that is, and a lot of time we see this to be a issue. The other thing is failure to address counter arguments, not discussing alternative perspectives or addressing potential criticism. See, like what I said, of the research diminishes the depth of your analysis. So you are analyzing the literature, you're not summarizing the literature, right? So keep that in mind, that we are in the lit review chapter, we are analyzing and criticizing. It is called a critical literature review. The reason why it has to be critical is your research then depends upon that criticism. Yeah, you are figuring out a research question because somebody did something, but there was something missing. Yeah, they did ABC, but the last part D is missing, and now you are going to do that part. Yeah, so that becomes your research question, your foundation of your research. But if you do not understand the ABC, how will you justify that D is needed? Which is why critical evaluation is important in literature review. Next is lack of clarity in defining terms and objectives. So unclear objectives and aims. Sometimes thesis lack clear, well-defined objectives or research questions, which can confuse the purpose and scope of research. And this I see many times, and on many occasions, what I've seen is that the research question is not even mentioned in the chapter 1. Chapter 1 has to be like a mini thesis. It should say, this is a problem, this is a research question, this is how we are going to solve it, and these rest of the chapters tell a bit more about everything. Yeah, so that is the idea of an introduction chapter, which is why I said that the introduction chapter is very important. It is like a snapshot of your whole thesis. Abstract is like an executive summary, but introduction is an extension of abstract. So you tell everything, but in a very succinct manner. But if these key things are missing or not clear, then it really reduces the value of your thesis. Next is unsubstantiated claims. So, making assertions without appropriate evidence or robust argumentation to support them can significantly weaken a thesis. And this is a skill. Yeah. So what happens is, many a times, if you are if you have not done research before, and you have not got sufficient training, you try to write things which are academically not acceptable. The reason is, you cannot mention something without a strong foundation or supporting literature that says something along those lines. Yeah, so you always have to be very careful on each and every sentence that is written in your thesis. What I typically tend to do with my PhD scholars is, I'll tell them, if you have given me 10 sentences or one page, 15 sentences, imagine, I tell them that break down each sentence by sentence, and tell me what is this sentence about and why is it there. Yeah, so that very thing is important, because then you see, oh, I'm not saying anything useful in this sentence, maybe I don't need this. Oh, this is maybe repeating what I have said here, why don't I just combine these things two together? So every sentence that is there in your write-up has to be there for a purpose. And read individual sentences and see whether it is adding any value or what is the purpose of that sentence. Take it as an exercise for you from this session, and just pick up anything that you have written so far. Take 10 sentences, and for each sentence, right next to it, what is this sentence adding to? Yeah, why is this sentence here? And if you do that, you will get a understanding of what is needed and what needs to be gone. Next is ethical issues. Non-compliance with ethical standards. Issues such as not obtaining necessary approvals for tests involving human subjects or not handling data confidentially and responsibly can create ethical issues, and this is your whole research will be unusable if you conduct research without getting ethical approvals. Okay, so this is a very important and a very critical thing, and I have seen a few cases where they started collecting their data in a rush or just out of excitement without having their ethics approval in place, and without having an ethics approval your research will not be acceptable, you know. No journal would publish your research without appropriate ethics in place, and the student in this case had to redo their data collection after getting the ethics approval. So that is another mistake, and a big mistake. Next is conclusion and implication not justified by data, right? So many a times what happens is you do too big, massive, or overarching conclusions from your research. So drawing conclusions that are not fully supported by data collected or analysis conducted can be a critical error. So whatever you are concluding, that conclusion has to come from the research that you have done. Yeah, it is not just randomly coming out of thin air. It has to be substantiated by the data that you have done, or the data that you have collected, or the analysis that you have completed. Okay. And next is poor discussion of implications. Not discussing or poorly discussing how the findings relate to the broader field of or their practical implications can also be problematic. So what this means is, when you have completed your research, you have to explain how is it going to benefit the say practically how it is useful. We call it practical implications or industry implications, which means how, or managerial implications. These are different words for, but they mean the same thing. How does your research help industry or managers to use your research in their business? Yes, that is a practical implication of your research. You have to mention that very clearly. And this very section, the practical implication, managerial implication, is probably the most important section for a different audience. Yeah, so if your thesis or if your paper is being read by somebody from the industry, they want to know how what you have done in your research could be useful for them. So keep that in mind, that practical implications you have to discuss. Next is environmental implications. Does your research have an impact on the environment? Is it better for your for the environment? Similarly, economic implications, social implications. All these things have to be included in your discussion, because, and it could also be at the start of your research in chapter 1 as well, that you mention the economic significance, environmental significance, depending upon what your research is, because it shows that you're doing a research that has impacts across various different areas, you know. So that is very very critical to remember and to include. Okay, so from these things, if I have to pick up top 3 mistakes, so one is inadequate engagement with literature. Yeah, so if you do not position your literature, if your research within the current literature that is out there, you cannot position it properly. You know, we will not know why you are doing this research, because typically research progresses in like a connected fashion, right? So you do literature review, you find that there are 10 different studies that have done this, but they haven't done this, and then you do this, and then your research gets connected to the previous research, right? So that chain, it has to be visible. So if you do not have the engagement with literature, it will make it very unclear for people to, you know, or to examiners, how your research actually fits within the other body of knowledge. The next is poor methodological execution. So the whichever method you choose, you have to make sure that you're executing it properly, you're following it step by step. And if that is not visible in your thesis, it is something that will be again picked up by the reviewers. Common mistakes include inappropriate or poorly justified research methods, inadequate data collection procedures, flawed analysis techniques. So, all this can undermine the reliability and validity of your research results. So, one thing that you have to include in your thesis is threats to validity, a section called as threats to validity. So, you have to mention, has there something that may happen or that could happen that would make your research invalid? So you can mention different things that should be considered. I'll not talk more about it here, but I'll probably make another video on threats of validity, but it is a very critical section to have in your thesis. Lack of rigor, I have already talked about. And deficient critical analysis and discussion. See, again, it is coming back to this. This analysis of literature is very, very important. And if you do not analyze the literature thoroughly and criticize it, critically analyze it, you are not building the strong foundation that is needed to justify the problem that you are going to choose. Yeah, this morning, actually, I got an email from a student, and he had not my student, somebody just who is a follower, follows me on my channel, and he sent me a brief proposal, like a one-page write-up about his framework. And what I noticed was that the problem itself was not very clear to me. So when I read through that research, that one pager, I could not understand what the problem is, although there is a solution and everything is there, but the problem itself was not clear to me. So I asked the student, how much time have you spent on working on this problem? What did you do to figure out that this is a problem? Finding out that a problem is the first step. So do spend time in formulating your problem properly, because everything that you do afterwards could either be useful or useless depending upon the problem. If the problem is very good, there is a lot of demand for that problem to be solved, your research will be very useful. But if nobody cares for the problem that you're trying to solve, your research will be of limited use. So keep that in mind. It is very crucial to remember that. Okay, so that is all I wanted to cover in today's session. So these are the top 10 mistakes that you should avoid to make sure that you pass your thesis perfectly without any issues. So if you're writing your thesis, please follow these instructions, please, these guidelines, these suggestions. At least you will make your thesis a little bit better, because you would know that you have addressed these mistakes which examiners will normally be picking up. Okay, so go through it again, review these mistakes, and start working on fixing your thesis before submitting. And as I told you before, no mistakes allowed at all in the introduction, abstract, and conclusion. Nothing, not even a mistake in the table of contents, not a spelling mistake, not a comma, nothing. It has to be perfect. The examiner or reviewer should not be able to find out any mistake in those sections. All right, so on that front, I would like to say thank you very much for joining this session. And please do let me know if you want me to make any other videos on topics that you are currently struggling with. Yeah, so thanks once again, and I'll see you again in tomorrow. Take care. Bye.